No alien suitor chose the young princess, until a human came forward. The registrar called my name by accident. I know that because I watched her run her finger down the wrong column, pause, frown at the page, and say it anyway. Marcus Vale, Liaison, Earth Diplomatic Corps, not a suitor, not a delegate with bonding rights. A footnote, a signature on a trade addendum that nobody in this room cared about until 30 seconds ago. Now 300 alien dignitaries were looking at me. I did not sit back down. The choosing hall on Velkaran Prime was the kind of place that made you feel small in a very deliberate way. The ceiling arched up into darkness that moved, not shadows, actual living darkness, a species of bioluminescent organism that the Velkaran kept as living chandeliers. The walls were carved from something between stone and bone. The floor was inlaid with the bonding seals of every house that had ever stood in this hall and made a decision that history remembered. I had been standing against the back wall for 4 hours. My job was to observe, keep my mouth shut, and sign 3 pages of interstellar trade agreements during the reception afterward. That was the full scope of my purpose on Velkaran Prime. The United Nations Diplomatic Corps had sent me because I was available, fluent in 2 of the 4 dominant dialects, and in the words of my supervisor, unlikely to cause an incident. My supervisor was about to have a very bad day. The Suitors' conclave happened once a generation. When a Velkaran royal came of age and the bonding window opened, every allied and aspirant species sent their best forward. It was political theater with actual consequences. A bonded alliance meant trade rights, military cooperation, shared resource grids. An unbonded princess meant a dominion signaling weakness. 2 unbonded cycles meant something closer to a wound. Princess Ethira of the Velkaran Dominion was going through her 2nd cycle. I had read her file on the transport over. Everyone on the diplomatic circuit had read her file, the way you read a case study in a course you did not choose to take. 26 cycles old by Velkaran reckoning, which put her somewhere around 32 in Earth years depending on which orbital conversion table you trusted. Heir to the 2nd largest dominion in the outer reach, educated in 4 systems, spoke 7 languages, one of which no other member of her court spoke at all. The file did not mention that last part. I found it in a footnote buried in a linguistic survey from 9 years ago. I read footnotes. It is a professional habit that has saved my life twice and complicated it considerably more than that. She sat on the dais at the front of the hall in a chair that was not quite a throne and not quite an ordinary seat, something in between, designed to say that she was important without looking like she was trying to say so. Her robes were the deep silver blue of the Velkaran ruling house. Her features were what human observers always struggled to describe in reports, structured in ways that human faces were not, with a brow ridge that caught the bioluminescent light, eyes that were a color I did not have a clean word for, and an expression that had been perfectly neutral for the entire 4 hours I had been in this room. Not calm, neutral, there is a difference. Calm is something you feel. Neutral is something you perform when what you actually feel would be inconvenient. I recognized it because I had worn that expression myself, in rooms where someone had power over something I cared about, and I could not afford to let them know I cared. The suitors had come forward one by one, 30 seconds each. The Velkaran conclave protocol was exact. You presented yourself, stated your house and standing, offered your formal petition, and waited for the preliminary acknowledgement that would move you to the next stage. 22 suitors. 22 declines. Some were graceful. The Suvari delegate from the 3rd ring had bowed deeply and withdrawn without explanation, which was considered polite. The Thavine representative had cited a scheduling conflict with his home system's legislative calendar, which everyone in the hall understood was not a scheduling conflict. The Morkai warlord had not been polite. He was the 22nd suitor, and he was also the largest living creature I had ever been in a room with 9 feet of gray-plated mass that moved like something that had never needed to learn caution. He stood before the dais and spoke in the grinding bass register of his species, and the translation drone at my shoulder rendered his words in a flat, clinical voice that made them worse for being so even. The candidate presents as emotionally unstable. Such instability in a bonded partner creates strategic liability. The Morkai delegation withdraws its petition. 300 people heard that. Ethira's face did not move. That was the thing that hit me, not the insult, which was enormous, not the political damage, which was real. The thing that hit me was the effort it took not to move. I could see it in the set of her shoulders. The way her hands, resting on the arms of the not-quite throne, did not tighten. The way she breathed exactly once evenly and then continued to look at the middle distance. She had practice, that was the terrible part. She had done this before, taken something that should have broken her composure and put it somewhere internal where nobody could reach it. And then she had kept sitting there. Because this was her hall and these were her obligations, and she did not get to leave. The Morkai delegate left instead. The registrar, a small Velkaran official whose name I never learned, stood at her podium and looked at her list with the expression of someone who has run out of good options and is now considering the bad ones. She ran her finger down the page. She stopped. She frowned. She said my name. The room turned. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in the 3 seconds between her saying my name and me stepping forward. It was not heroism. It was not strategy. It was not even a coherent thought. It was the image of Ethira's hands on the arms of the not-quite throne, not tightening, and the full weight of what that cost. I stepped away from the wall. Someone behind me made a sound. My assistant, a young man named Peter Cole, who had been my shadow for 6 months and had never once seen me do anything unexpected, whispered a single syllable that was not a word in any language. I walked to the center of the floor. The 30-second clock began. Ethira looked at me the way you look at a weather event, not with hope, not with dread, with the specific attention you give to something you cannot yet categorize. I looked back. I was a 31-year-old human from a species that had been in interstellar contact for less than a decade. I had no house seal to offer, no military fleet, no resource grid. I had a 2-bedroom apartment back on Earth that I had not been inside in 4 months, a commendation from the Outer Reach liaison office that nobody here had heard of, and a very detailed knowledge of diplomatic footnotes. I had 30 seconds. I did not use them on credentials. I looked at her directly, not at the dais, not at the court, not at the space above her head that public speakers aim for when they are performing, and I spoke to her the way you speak to a person who is standing right in front of you. I said, I see what just happened. I said, I think it was wrong. I said, I am not going to pretend I didn't see it. 3 sentences, no formal petition. No house credentials, no political framework. The translation drone hesitated. This was not normal drone behavior. Velkaran translation drones did not hesitate. They had processing cores that handled 14 dialects simultaneously in real time. A hesitation meant the drone had encountered a phrase that did not map cleanly onto any approved equivalent. When it finally spoke, it rendered my words in something that the court clearly found confusing and possibly alarming. My assistant told me later that the closest Velkaran equivalent for what I had said was somewhere between, I acknowledge your battle wound, and I am not frightened by the thing that frightens others. I did not correct the translation. The 30 seconds ended. The registrar looked at her page, then at me, then at her page again. Nobody moved. Then, from the dais, from the woman who had sat in perfect performed neutrality for 4 hours through 22 declines, and 1 public insult delivered by a 9-foot wall of contempt, came a single sound. Not a word, not yet. A breath released real. The kind you take when you have been holding something for a very long time, and you finally, just for 1 second, set it down. I cataloged it the way I cataloged everything that was about to change my life. Quietly, without letting my face do the thing it wanted to do. I did not sit back down. The 30-second clock had ended, and nobody had told me to sit down. That was either a very good sign or the particular kind of disaster that begins with a clerical error and ends with an interstellar incident report. In my experience, those two things looked identical right up until they didn't. Peter appeared at my elbow. He was 24, from Norwich, and had the specific expression of a man watching a controlled explosion from slightly too close. "You are not on the registry," he said. "I know. You are a trade liaison." "I know. Should I be writing something down?" "Probably." The Velkarin court registrar had not moved from her podium. She was looking at me with an expression I had learned to read over 3 years of first contact work, the expression of a bureaucrat who has encountered something outside her procedural framework and is trying to locate the correct protocol before the situation evolves without her. I helped her out. I said, in Velkarin formal register, that I understood my presence on the registry was irregular, that I had no intention of claiming rights or standing that had not been formally extended, and that I was prepared to sit down if the court so directed. I said it cleanly, with correct case endings, which I knew mattered to them the way the right form number mattered to a government office. It signaled that you respected the structure even when you were working around it. The court did not direct me to sit down. What it did instead was produce, from the middle tier of the observation gallery, a voice that belonged to High Arbiter Sorvan, a Velkarin official whose title translated roughly as chief of what is and is not permitted, and who had the look of a man who had spent 40 years being the last person in a room to be surprised by anything. He was looking at me now with an expression that suggested I was about to test that record. He asked, in the flat register used for procedural challenges, what bonding rights a human representative carried under the current terms of the Earth-Velkarin Contact Accord. I knew the answer because I had read the accord 7 times on the transport, including the annexes, including the footnotes of the annexes, including the single line in footnote 14C that everyone else had apparently decided did not matter. It mattered. It said that, in the absence of a formal species exclusion clause, any representative of a contact accord signatory state present at a recognized bonding conclave held standing equivalent to their diplomatic rank. My diplomatic rank was senior liaison, grade 4. Grade 4 was, by the accord's own cross-reference table, equivalent to a Velkarin Tier 2 petitioner. Tier 2 petitioners had the right to present. I said all of this, quietly, without drama, the way you read a building's address off a plaque. The court gallery made a sound like a room full of people recalculating a number they thought they already knew. High Arbiter Sorvan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that my standing would be noted, and the presentation period would be extended for review. Peter exhaled behind me. I did not. What happened next was the part nobody writes about in the diplomatic briefings, because it does not fit into any of the standard categories. The presentation period extension meant that I was still standing in the center of the floor. The Suitor registry was still open, and Ethyra was still sitting on the dais, watching me with that same unclassifiable attention, the weather event look, except that something in it had shifted slightly in a direction I did not yet have a name for. The court expected me to present properly this time. Credentials, house affiliation, political offer, the full 30-second structure. I thought about what she had sat through for 4 hours. I decided to try something else. I said, my name is Marcus Vale. I am from Earth, which is a planet most people in this room have seen exactly once on a star chart. I have no house. I have no fleet. I have no standing in this hall beyond one procedural footnote that I am using right now because it exists and I am allowed to. I am not here because my government sent me for this. I am here because the registrar said my name, and when I looked at you, sitting down seemed wrong. The translation drone hesitated again. Longer this time. When it rendered the speech, 3 separate delegates in the gallery leaned toward their neighbors to confer. The Suvari block produced a collective murmur. One of the younger Velkaran court officials actually wrote something down, which told me the content had been unusual enough to warrant a record. High Arbiter Sorvan asked, with the deliberate patience of a man choosing each word as if it cost money, what humans considered the basis for a bonding petition, if not house standing or political alliance. I said preference. The hall went quiet in a specific way, not the silence of shock, the silence of a room full of people hearing a word they know but suddenly uncertain they understand it. Sorvan said, preference is not a political category. I said, on Earth it is the only category. This was not entirely true, because nothing involving human marital and partnership history is ever entirely anything. But it was true enough for this room and this moment, and the thing I was trying to say. Ethira had not looked away from me since I stepped forward. I noticed this the way you notice a detail that seems small, and then turns out to be the entire point. Sorvan called a procedural recess. 20 minutes. This was, Peter informed me in a rapid whisper as we stepped to the side of the hall, essentially unprecedented. Conclave proceedings did not recess. They concluded. The recess meant that what I had done had created something the court structure did not have an existing slot for, and they needed 20 minutes to build one. I spent the recess standing near the east wall, watching the court officials move between each other in the rapid, low-register communication style that meant active political problem-solving. Peter asked me if I had a plan. I told him I had a footnote and a general direction. He wrote something in his notebook. I watched Ethira. She had turned slightly in the not-quite-throne to speak with her chief advisor, a Velkaran elder named Counselor Veth, who had the expression of someone doing emergency structural engineering on a building that had already been constructed. Ethira was listening. She was nodding in the correct places. She was performing the role of a princess receiving counsel. Her eyes came to me once during the 20 minutes. Once for about 3 seconds, and then back to Veth. 3 seconds is not a long time. 3 seconds is exactly long enough to ask a question without using words, if you are the kind of person who communicates that way. She apparently was. I did not look away during the 3 seconds. The recess ended. Sorvan returned to his position. He announced, in the careful register of a man establishing a precedent he was not entirely comfortable with, that the human representative's petition would be entered into the registry under provisional standing, pending a review of Earth-Velkaran contact protocols, and that the formal presentation period would resume at the next session. He looked at me when he said the next part. He said that the court wished to understand, for the record, what specifically a human representative meant when he cited preference as the basis for a bonding petition. The entire hall was waiting for my answer. I took one breath. I said, it means that when I look at her, I am not calculating. It means that the reasons I am standing here are not reasons I can put in a column and add up. It means that I looked at someone being dismissed by 22 different people for 22 different reasons that all came down to the same thing, that she was inconvenient to want, and I found that I could not agree with any of them. The drone translated. This time it did not hesitate. This time the word it added at the end, quietly, almost as a note to itself, was a Velkaran term I had to look up later. It meant something close to an action taken without strategic calculation, driven entirely by the recognition of worth in another. The Velkaran had a word for it. They just had not heard it used in a conclave before. Then from the dais, in a voice that was not the formal court register, in a voice that was lower and more direct, and had none of the performance in it, Ethyra spoke. In English. Clean, precise, slightly formal English, with an accent that had been learned from recordings rather than from a living speaker, which gave it a quality that was almost musical in its exactness. She said, "You read footnote 14C. The hall did not know what to do with this. I did. I said, I read all the footnotes. For the first time since I had been in this hall, the neutrality shifted. Not into a smile, it was not a smile. It was something smaller and more real than a smile. The very slight adjustment of a person who has just discovered something they were not expecting to find. She looked at me for exactly as long as she chose to. Then she turned back to face the court, and her expression went neutral again, and she became the princess once more. But I had seen the thing underneath. That was enough. For now it was enough. The formal objections arrived before I had finished my morning briefing the next day. Peter slid 3 separate data tablets across the table in my temporary quarters, a room in the diplomatic wing of the conclave complex that had been assigned to me under the category of extended liaison accommodation, a bureaucratic reclassification that had taken Sorvan's office approximately 11 minutes to process, which told me they had expected this might go longer than 1 day. 3 tablets, 3 factions, 3 reasons all dressed up in formal language that came down to the same core complaint. They did not like what I was doing, and they wanted the court to make me stop. I read all 3 before I ate breakfast. The Morkai objection was filed by Warlord Drevak himself, which was a notable choice, because warlords did not typically engage personally with procedural filings. They had staff for that. The fact that Drevak had signed his own name told me he was bothered in a way that went beyond politics. The objection cited something called temporal incompatibility. The Morkai lived, on average, 260 Earth years. The Velkaran lived somewhere between 180 and 220 depending on the individual. Humans lived, by interstellar standards, a remarkably short time. The filing said, in language that was technical enough to seem neutral and wasn't, that bonding a Velkaran royal to a human would subject her to the near-certain experience of watching her bonded partner age and die within her own natural lifespan, and that this constituted a form of deliberate long-term harm that no responsible court should sanction. It was, I had to admit, a real argument. It was also the most compassionate-sounding thing the Morkai delegation had produced since arriving, which was interesting given what Drevak had said about her on the floor yesterday. The Suvari objection was a group filing, signed by all 11 members of the Suvari collective bloc. It cited emotional regulation variants. The Suvari were, by species biology, extremely low affect, not cold, but calibrated. Their emotional range was narrow and deep rather than wide and variable. From their perspective, human emotional range was not a feature. It was a malfunction. The filing used the word unstable 3 times. I noted that this was the same word Drevak had used about Ethyra yesterday, which said something interesting about who was framing this conversation and how. The third objection came from inside the Velkaran court itself. It was not filed publicly. It came as a sealed note from Counselor Veth, addressed to me personally, and it said, in very polite and very firm terms, that this was simply not how things were done. No specific law cited, no procedural rule, just the weight of that sentence. This is not how things are done. I had heard that sentence many times in my career. It was the sentence that closed doors. It was also, in my experience, the sentence that people reached for when they had run out of better arguments. I finished breakfast. Then I called Peter in and told him we had work to do. The Morkai objection required an official response through the conclave procedural office. Peter drafted the initial framework while I worked through the cross-reference tables. What I found, 3 layers into the Accord documentation, was that the temporal incompatibility clause the Morkai had cited was from an older version of interspecies bonding guidelines that the Velkuren themselves had voted to retire 6 years ago. It had been replaced by a clause stating that lifespan differential was a factor to be disclosed, not a factor that constituted automatic disqualification. I filed our response by mid-morning. The Suvari objection required a different approach because it was not really about me. It was about her. The emotional instability language was the same language Drevak had used in public, and the Suvari filing had borrowed it, consciously or not, which meant the narrative was spreading. If enough voices repeated it in enough official documents, it would calcify into an accepted truth. I went to see Counselor Veth. Veth's office was on the upper level of the court complex, a room full of things that had been kept a long time, records, objects, the particular quality of air that gathers in places where important decisions have been made repeatedly over many years. He was older than anyone else I had seen in this building. He looked at me the way very old people sometimes look at very young ones, not with contempt, but with the full awareness of everything you do not yet know. He did not offer me a seat. I did not take one. I said, "The Suvari filing uses language about her that is not accurate and is being allowed to stand without challenge, and I want to know why the court is not challenging it." He said, "The court does not dispute what suitors choose to say in their filings." I said, "The court disputes everything else procedurally. Why not this?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because challenging it would require the court to define what she actually is, which is a conversation the court has been carefully not having." I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, much more quietly, "She is not unstable. She is present. There is a difference. Most of the species in that hall cannot distinguish between the two because they have never encountered something that was simply and fully present without managing itself for their comfort." He said it like a man handing me something he had been holding for a long time. Then he said, "This does not mean I think you should be here." I said, "I know." He said, "It means I will not file against you personally. What I filed was procedural. You are an irregularity in a system that does not accommodate irregularities well." I said, "I understand." He said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes. You are not trying to protect her from me. You are trying to protect her from hope, because hope that gets withdrawn is worse than no hope at all. You have watched her go through this once already, and you are not willing to watch it again." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You are very good at reading rooms." I said, "I read footnotes. Rooms are easier." I left his office without a clear win and without a clear loss, but he did not refile. The personal objection, the not how things are done note, remained sealed and went no further. The faction objections went to a formal review panel. While they were being processed, the court's protocol committee informed me that I was now technically in the preliminary consideration period, which meant I had access to the scheduled activities through which the court evaluated petitioners. The first scheduled activity was a public appearance at the Hall of Records ceremony, a formal event, lots of dignitaries, a great deal of standing in specific places at specific times. Ethyra and I were positioned, by protocol, about 30 feet apart for most of it. She did not look at me during the ceremony. I did not look at her during the ceremony. We were both very professionally not looking at each other, which is its own kind of communication. After the ceremony, in the corridor between the Hall of Records and the reception suite, I turned a corner and she was there. Not by accident. The Velkuren did not turn corners by accident in their own complex. She was alone, which was also not an accident. She looked at me the way she had looked at me during the 3-second moment in the recess. Direct, without the court performance layer, without the neutrality she wore in public like a second set of clothing. She said in English, "Why are you still here?" It was not a polite question. It was not a formal question. It was the question she had probably been turning over since yesterday, the one she needed an actual answer to rather than a diplomatic one. I said, "I don't know how to explain it as a strategy because it isn't one. I keep making decisions in this building, and they all seem to lead me back to the same room you're in. I've stopped trying to figure out if that's a good idea and started just doing it." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That is not a reassuring answer." I said, "No, but it's the true one." She said, "The Morkai objection is not wrong, about the lifespan." I said, "I know." She said, "That does not concern you." I said, "It concerns me exactly as much as it should concern anyone who is paying attention, but it's not a reason." She said, "What is a reason?" I looked at her, not at the space above her head, at her. I said, "You sat in that hall for 4 hours and you did not break. Not once. Not even at the end. And when I looked at you, I did not see weakness. I saw someone carrying something very heavy in a room full of people who did not notice the weight and would not have helped with it anyway." She was very still. I said, "I noticed the weight. That is all I can tell you right now. I noticed it and I couldn't pretend I hadn't." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The corridor is being monitored by court protocol officials." I said, "I know." She said, "This conversation is being recorded." I said, "I know that too." She said, "You do not seem bothered." I said, "I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say in the hall." She almost did something with her expression then, almost. She turned and walked back toward the reception suite, her robes moving the way water moves when it has somewhere specific to go. I stayed in the corridor. The wall, metaphorically and very deliberately, was warm. The formal consideration period began on the 9th day. 60 days of structured evaluation. That was the Velkaran protocol. Public appearances, council interviews, compatibility hearings, documentation reviews. At the end of it, the court would deliver a standing assessment, and then, only then, the princess would be asked to make her choice. Peter sat across from me the morning it was announced and said, 60 days. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you are prepared for 60 days of this?" I said, "What's the alternative?" He opened his mouth, closed it, wrote something in his notebook, and then said no more about it. The compatibility hearings were held in a chamber off the main hall, before a panel of 3 court assessors whose job it was to evaluate whether a petitioner met the minimum standards for consideration. The standards were extensive. They covered political standing, resource holdings, biological compatibility indices, lineage documentation, and in a separate category that I found fascinating, something the Velkaran called the Stability Index, a composite score built from behavioral observation, past record, and what the documentation described as demonstrated consistency of character under pressure. The hearings were public. The gallery was full each time. I treated them like depositions. I had done depositions before in a previous chapter of my career that I did not discuss at diplomatic functions. I answered every question exactly as asked, no more and no less. I did not perform. I did not deflect. I did not try to seem better or worse than I was. The assessors were not accustomed to this. The second hearing, 3 days in, the lead assessor asked me about Earth's bonding traditions in a way that was clearly designed to surface the parts that would read poorly in a Velkaran framework. Divorce rates, dissolution protocols, the statistical frequency with which humans entered and exited long-term partnerships. I answered honestly. I gave them the numbers. I gave them the context. I said, yes, humans end bonds. We also form them for reasons that have nothing to do with political calculation, which means they occasionally fail because they were built on something real rather than something strategic, and real things are harder to maintain than strategic ones. The assessor looked at me. I said, I think that is a feature, not a flaw, but I understand why it reads differently from where you are sitting. The gallery murmured. I noticed Ethira in the observation tier, which she was not required to attend and was not expected at, sitting slightly apart from her court attendants, and watching the hearing with the focused attention she gave things she was actually thinking about rather than things she was simply required to observe. She was at every hearing. She never gave any indication that she noticed I had noticed this. The tests she ran were not cruel. I want to be clear about that. They were not designed to trap me or break me or expose some hidden flaw. They were the tests of someone who had been given reasons to distrust the gap between what people appeared to be and what they actually were. She needed to know if those two things were the same in me. The first test was a public one. On the 14th day, during a formal reception, she said something to me, in front of court officials, 3 visiting dignitaries, and Peter, who was hovering nearby with the expression of someone who had accepted that his life was now permanently irregular. That was designed to give me an easy opportunity to make her look bad in a subtle way that no one else would necessarily catch. I did not take it. She noted that. The second test was private. In the archive corridor, a pattern was forming, she asked me, with no warning and no framing, what I thought of a specific court decision that had been made regarding her during her first bonding cycle. A decision that had been made without her input, over her clear preference, and recorded in the court documents with language that smoothed over what had actually happened. I had read those documents. Obviously, I had read them. I said, I think it was a decision made by people who cared about the Dominion more than they cared about you specifically, and I think those two things should not have been in conflict, and I think you have been living with the result of that conflict ever since. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, and you think you are different from those people. I said, I think I am here for a different reason than those people were. I cannot promise more than that right now. I failed the third test. I want to be honest about it. On the 22nd day, a junior court official delivered a document to me that appeared to be a procedural form requiring my signature. It was routine in appearance. I signed it without reading the secondary clause on the back page. The secondary clause was not malicious. It was a language waiver, authorizing the court to conduct my recorded hearings in Velkaran formal register without concurrent English transcription. It seemed minor. Procedurally, it was not minor. It would have meant that the record of my hearings existed only in a language I read well but not perfectly, which would have allowed the court to record things with a degree of interpretive latitude. Ethira told me about it that evening. Not because she had arranged the test. She hadn't. She told me because someone in the court had done it without her knowledge and she thought I should know. I said I should have read it, that's on me. She said, you signed it. I said, yes, I will not do it again. She looked at me for a moment, expecting, I think, something more, an explanation, a defense, a context that made it better. I had none to offer. I had not read the document, that was the whole story. She said, most people explain themselves. I said, explaining it would not change what I did. I missed something I should not have missed. The correct response is to acknowledge it and do better. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness. It was not softness. It was more like a recalibration, a small internal adjustment of a framework that had just encountered a data point it had not expected. She said carefully, you are not what I was prepared for. I said, what were you prepared for? She said, someone performing patience. Everyone who has stood in this hall has performed patience in the direction of something they wanted from me. You are the first person I have encountered in this process who seems to be exercising actual patience in my direction rather than performing it toward a goal. I said, I have a goal. She said, I know, but your patience does not feel like the goal's instrument. It feels like its own thing. I thought about that for a moment. I said, on Earth we have a saying, it doesn't translate well. She said, tell me anyway. I said, the saying is, you cannot rush something you want to last. She was quiet. Then the 41st day arrived, and with it, the council session that I had known was coming since the first week. High Arbiter Sorvan convened a formal session, in front of the full court. He said, in the measured register he used for things that were going to be difficult, that the court wished to formally enter into the record what it considered to be a significant consideration that had not yet been explicitly addressed in the proceedings. He looked at me. He said, Marcus Vale of Earth, by the biological and chronological documentation on record, your projected natural lifespan ends approximately 147 years before the projected natural lifespan of the princess. In practical terms, she will outlive you if you are bonded by more than a century. The court considers this not merely a logistical matter, but a significant burden of foreseeable grief that it would be placing on the Dominion's future sovereign. The court asks whether you have a response. The gallery was very quiet. Sorvan said, the court does not ask this to be unkind. It asks because it is the court's responsibility to name what others will not name. He was right. It was a real argument. I stood up. I said yes. Just that. Just the one word. I let it sit there for a moment. Then I said, and she still gets to choose. The hall was absolutely still. I said, I am not going to argue with the math. The math is correct. I will live a human lifespan and she will continue after it ends, and that will be hard. I am not going to tell you it won't be hard, or that it doesn't matter, or that there is some framework in which it is not a real cost. It is a real cost. I know that. I said, but she is standing here in this hall being asked to make a decision about her own life, and I have heard, in the last 41 days, a great number of reasons why the decision should be made for her. By the court, by other species, by the weight of tradition and protocol and what has always been done. Every one of those reasons arrives with someone else's name on it. I said this one would arrive with her own name on it, and that is different. Sorvan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, and not in the formal register, but in something lower and more genuine, you understand that you are arguing for something that will cause her pain. I said, I am arguing for her right to decide what she is willing to carry. Those are not the same thing. Ethyra was in the gallery. She was looking at me. Not with the weather event attention, not with the court performance neutrality. With something that had no category in the documentation I had read. I sat down. Peter, beside me, wrote a single line in his notebook. He turned it slightly so I could read it. It said, I think you are going to need a longer contract. The formal declaration date was set for the 58th day. 2 days early, Sorvan's office issued the change of schedule without explanation, which in the Velcurin system meant the explanation was obvious to anyone paying attention. The faction objections had been resolved, the Morkai filing dismissed on the retired clause precedent, the Suvari filing set aside pending further review, which in diplomatic language meant it was going to sit in a drawer until the situation resolved itself. The court was ready to move. So was I. The Accord of Intent was the Velcurin's highest formal declaration. It had been delivered 47 times in recorded Velcurin history. I had read all 47. They were extraordinary documents, structured, layered, built from approved phrases arranged in a sequence that had been refined across centuries to say the maximum amount in the most precise language possible. Every one of them was addressed to the court. Not one of them was addressed to her. I decided to fix that. Peter found out about my plan on the morning of the 58th day when I showed him my draft. He read it. He read it again. Then he said, in a very calm voice that meant he was not calm at all, You know that none of this is in the approved format. I said, I know. He said, you know that departing from the approved format in an accord of intent has never been done. I said, I know. He said, you know that Sorvan is going too. I said, Peter. He said, yes. I said, write something down. He wrote something down. I did not look at what it was. He put the notebook away. He said, I'll have the transport on standby, just in case. I said, that's good thinking. The hall filled up an hour before the ceremony began. I had not seen it this full since the first day, every gallery tier packed, every diplomatic post occupied, every seat in the court floor taken. Word had spread through the complex in the way that significant things spread, without announcement, traveling through the channels that exist in every institution between the formal and the informal. Something was going to happen today. Everyone felt it. I stood in the staging corridor outside the main hall and did what I always did before I walked into a room where something mattered. I read through the draft one more time. I checked each line, not for grammar, for truth. Each sentence had to be something I actually meant, or it was not worth saying in this hall in front of these people. Every line held. I put the draft in my inside pocket, straightened my jacket, a human thing, a meaningless gesture that I had made before important moments since I was 23, and it had become the signal I gave myself that I was ready, and walked into the hall. The ceremony opened with the formal protocol. Sorvan presided. The court assembled in sequence. Ethira entered last, as protocol required, in the deep silver blue of the ruling house, and took her position on the dais. I watched her walk to the dais and thought, she carries it exactly the same way she did on the first day. The weight is still there. She has not set it down, but she carries it differently now. There is something in the way she holds her shoulders that was not there on day one, and I had watched her closely enough across 58 days to be certain it was new. The protocol officer called my name. I walked to the center of the floor. I looked at her. She looked at me. Sorvan said, the accord of intent will now be delivered. The petitioner will speak. I reached into my pocket. I put the draft on the floor beside me, which was not protocol, and produced an audible sound from the gallery. Then I left it there. I had read it enough times. I did not need to hold it. I said, I am going to speak in English. The translation drone will render as I go. I am doing this not because I cannot speak in Velkaran formal register, but because I want you to hear the words as I actually mean them, not as I can render them in a language I learned from documentation. What I am going to say has too much weight to risk losing in translation. The gallery murmured. Sorvan nodded once, concession noted. I said, Ethira. Just her name. Just that first, so that everything that followed would arrive with her name already in the air, so that the court would understand from the very first word that this was addressed to a person and not to a process. I said, I have sat in this hall and in the rooms adjacent to it for 58 days. I have watched the people in this building try to locate me in their existing categories: petitioner, diplomat, irregularity, precedent, problem. I understand the impulse. Categories are useful. They let you know what to expect. I have been difficult to categorize because I did not arrive here the way things are expected to arrive here. I said, I arrived because a registrar made an error and I looked at you and sitting down felt wrong. I want to be honest about that because there is no heroic version of it. There is only the true version, which is that something in me recognized something in you before I had the language for what I was recognizing. I spent the first week trying to find the strategic rationale. I did not find one. I stopped looking. I said, I'm not going to tell you that I am the right choice in the way this hall has historically defined right choices. I have no fleet. I have no resource grid. I have one planet, which is young and loud and chaotic and full of people who argue constantly and build things and break them and build them again. And by the standards of every species represented in this room, We are doing this entire civilization project in a state of cheerful disorder that probably looks alarming from the outside. I said, I am going to tell you instead what I have observed in 58 days of watching you. I said, you are not unstable. You are present. You are present in a way that is rare in people and rarer in positions like yours, where being present means being available to be hurt, and the sensible thing, the protected thing, would be to stop being fully present and start being managed and careful and distant. You have not done that. It costs you something every day not to do that. I have watched you pay that cost and not mention it and keep paying it. I said, you speak 7 languages, one of which no one in your court speaks. I have thought about that since I read the footnote 9 weeks ago, and I think I understand it now. You learned a language that no one around you could speak, so that there was something in your mind that was entirely your own. A private space inside your own thoughts. That is the act of someone who knows the value of having something that cannot be taken from you. I said, I do not want to take anything from you. I want to be someone you can speak to in whatever language is truest, including the one no one else knows, including silence, including the language you were using when you looked at me in the recess on the first day, and I understood exactly what you were asking even though you had not said anything. I said, the court has spent 58 days asking whether I am a suitable choice. I want to ask the question they have not asked, which is, suitable for what? Suitable to stand next to someone and make decisions about her without consulting her. Suitable to be cataloged in the bonding records as a political asset. Suitable to be present in the way that is convenient and absent in the ways that require effort. I said, I am not suitable for any of those things. I am not interested in any of those things. I said, I am here because I choose to be. I am here because preference, which is not a political category, and I understand that, and I do not care, is the only honest basis I have. I am here because when I am in a different room from where you are, I am aware of it in a way that I cannot talk myself out of, and I have tried, because there are excellent reasons to try, and I am not a person who ignores excellent reasons. I said, the reasons have not worked. I said, I know what it costs. I heard the court name the cost explicitly, and I said yes, and I meant it. Yes, I will live a human life, which by Velcoran standards is a short one. Yes, there will be a chapter of your very long story in which I am present and chapters after it in which I am not. I know that. I am not asking you to pretend that is not the truth. I said, I am asking you to decide whether the chapter in which I am present is worth having on its terms, not on the terms of every chapter combined, on its own terms. I think it is. I think I can spend a human life being someone who sees you clearly and chooses you deliberately and shows up to the hard rooms and reads the footnotes and does not manage you or minimize you or categorize you as a liability when you are simply, specifically, undeniably present. I said, I think that is worth something. I said, but I am not the one who gets to decide what it is worth to you. That is yours. It has always been yours. The entire point, the only point I have been trying to make in this hall for 58 days is that it is yours. I stopped. The hall was completely silent. Not the silence of a room that is waiting. The silence of a room that has received something and has not yet finished receiving it. The translation drone had rendered each line as I spoke. I knew because I could hear the faint delay behind each sentence, the drone's voice trailing mine at a remove of 3 seconds. I did not know exactly how the court had heard it. I knew how I had meant it. Sorvan sat very still. I looked at him. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor in front of him with the expression of a man doing something internal that he did not want witnessed. Then from somewhere in the middle gallery, a sound. A chair moved. The Morkai ambassador, not Drevak, but the senior diplomatic aide who had remained after Drevak filed his objection, stood. He looked at me across the hall. He inclined his head. One single inclination, he sat back down. From the Suvari block, no movement. but the cluster of 11 delegates was very still in a way that was different from their usual stillness. The stillness of people who had encountered a register they had not expected. Sorvan cleared his throat. He said, in a voice that was formally composed and entirely genuine at the same time, "The court will now hear the princess's response, should she choose to give one." Eithira stood. She did not use the formal acceptance script. I knew the formal acceptance script by memory. I had read it in the documentation, and what she said was not it. She stood and she looked at me, and she said one word. The same word she had said in the choosing hall on the first day. The one syllable she had sent across the room before anyone fully understood what was happening. I knew what it meant now. I had looked it up in the archive on the 32nd night, in the small hours when sleep had not been available, working through the linguistic database until I found it in a pre-classical Velkaran text, tucked into a poem about decisions made before their outcomes were certain. It did not mean yes. It meant I had already decided. I was waiting to see if you were. The drone translated it into English in 2 words. The 2 words it chose were, already decided. The hall broke apart then, not into chaos, but into the sound that a room makes when it releases something it has been holding. Voices, movement, the scrape of formal seats, dignitaries turning to each other. Sorvan brought the session to formal close with a single struck note from the ceremonial bell, his voice rising above the sound to record, in the formal language required for the court archives, that the petitioner Marcus Vale of Earth and Princess Eithira of the Velkaran Dominion had completed the accord of intent, and that the bonding consideration period was formally resolved in the affirmative. Peter was at my shoulder before I had finished walking back from the center of the floor. His notebook was open. He had written one line, which he showed me without comment. It said, "I will not need to keep the transport on standby." I put my hand briefly on his shoulder, and he nodded and moved off to begin the communication protocol he would need to run. The Earth Diplomatic Corps notice, the Trade Delegation update, the 14 procedural forms that a development of this nature required, all of which he would handle with complete competence, and almost none of which I would need to do anything about. The gallery was thinning. The formal session had closed. Court officials were moving through the hall managing the transition from ceremony to reception, which would begin in the East Hall in 40 minutes, and which would last approximately 3 hours, and which I would need to be present for and appropriately diplomatic throughout. 40 minutes. I had 40 minutes. Eithira stepped down from the dais. Her chief attendant moved to follow her, and she said something in low Velkaran that I did not fully catch, and the attendant stopped and stepped back. She walked toward me. Not quickly, not slowly. The way she walked everywhere with the particular quality of someone who has learned not to arrive anywhere out of breath, because arriving out of breath means something got to you before you were ready. She stopped a few feet from me. The hall was nearly empty now. The bioluminescent chandeliers overhead moved in the slow rhythm they kept regardless of what happened underneath them. The carved walls held the quiet the way they had held the noise 20 minutes ago, completely, without preference. She said in English, "You read all the footnotes." I said, "Every one." She said, "That is a very specific quality in a person." I said, "It is. It tends to either serve you well or get you into trouble, depending on the room." She said, "And today?" I said, "I think today it served me well." She looked at me. The weather event attention, fully present, unguarded in a way that I had only seen in the corridor and the archive, and the small, unmanaged moments that occurred in the gaps between her public role and whatever she was when no one was performing at her. She said, "You said a great deal in there." I said, "Yes." She said, "Most of it I already knew." I said, "I know." She said, "I knew it before the 32nd day, possibly before the 20th. I said, "Then why?" She said, Because you needed to say it. Not for me. For yourself. You needed to stand in that hall and say it out loud in front of everyone so that it was real in the way that only things said aloud in public become real. You needed the room to witness it. I thought about that. I said, "You are probably right." She said, "I am right." There was something close to warmth in the way she said it. Not humor, not quite. Something adjacent to humor that was particular to her, the very slight edge of a person who knows they are correct and finds a specific satisfaction in the knowing. I said, "I have a question." She said, "Ask." I said, "The language, the one you learned alone, the one no one in your court speaks." She said, "What about it?" I said, "What language is it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is a dead language, a language that was spoken by a civilization that no longer exists. On a planet in the outer reach that has been uninhabited for 400 years. I learned it from archival recordings when I was 12. I found it in a footnote in a historical survey." She paused. She said, "I found it in a footnote." I looked at her. She looked at me. We stood in the nearly empty hall, under the bioluminescent chandeliers that moved in their slow rhythm, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was longer than 3 seconds and meant considerably more. I said, "You found it in a footnote." She said, "Yes." I said, "Of course you did." She said, "Yes." Later, much later, after the reception and the 3 hours of appropriate diplomacy and the endless procedural documentation and the communication back to Earth that I had to handle personally, because there was no form that adequately covered what had happened, someone asked me why I had stepped forward. The accidental name, the footnote standing, the man with no house and no fleet who had walked to the center of the floor and stayed there. I told them I did not know. That was a lie. I knew exactly. I had watched 37 species look at her and calculate the cost. Each of them had added up the numbers, the political value, the strategic benefit, the lifespan differential, the emotional complexity, the inconvenience of someone who was simply and fully present in a universe that found presence difficult to manage. Each of them had run the calculation and found a reason to step back. I had looked at the numbers. Then I had looked at her. There was no calculation available that produced the right answer when she was in the room. So I stopped calculating. Humans are not always the strongest species, or the longest-lived, or the most politically sophisticated, or the best resourced, or the most ancient, or the most feared. But we are extraordinarily good at deciding, in the moment when the math says stop, that the math was asking the wrong question. I put down the math. I stepped forward. That was all. That was everything.